I walk out the door. Mostly it's windy. I wear woolen jumpers, waterproof jackets, and walking shoes. No gloves. Sometimes a hat. I like wearing knitted jumpers. Second hand. Those that were used to identify drowned fishermen. One unique pattern for each family. I step out. I walk down the cliff. I always take the same route, ever since I started working here, 39 years ago, in 78, late spring. I have to walk slowly so I don't fall. When I reach the beach, I walk north for 4 miles. The beach is wide, so I first walk along the edge of the cliff, slowly, making sure not to miss any bird or part of a bird that has been washed ashore. Crows eat the dead birds, so often all that remains is a pair of wings. I have to go daily to compete with the crows. When I find oil on a body, I send it off to the lab at Heriot-Watt University. They can tell if it's crude oil or if it has been refined. If it's refined, it is fuel oil and could have been accidentally spilled during a ship-to-ship refuel. There are a lot of Navy ships out there. If it's crude oil, it's hard to believe the spill was accidental. When birds touch oil, it sticks to them immediately. Every drop stays. First on their feathers. Then it seeps through and reaches the skin. The oil penetrates the skin and enters their bodies. It's a slow process, but cannot be stopped. The oil burns right through their skin and their flesh, and reaches the blood in their veins. Then the oil flows with the blood through their body, eventually reaching the heart and the brain. The more aerial they are, the less time they spend touching the surface of the sea, the least likely they are to be oiled. The bigger the birds, the more likely they will pick up oil. Gannets, for example, are often filled with oil.
So good morning. I think we're going to leave that there. But we just wanted to show a quick clip of some of Grace's work as a kind of introduction to this morning's conversation. So just very quickly, my name's Rose Lejeune, and I'm the founder of an organization called Performance Exchange, which was supposed to be a program of 20 performances over different commercial galleries, working with artists who were represented by those galleries this summer. Obviously, the program has been slightly delayed, but we wanted in the meantime to carry on kind of doing a few conversations around, I guess, some of the kind of concerns that were at the heart of what we were trying to think about with Performance Exchange. So this is the second of a series of conversations that we've done with some of the artists that are going to be involved in the program, this morning with Grace Schwindt. And also we wanted to bring in some kind of conversations or some voices from other curators that those artists had worked with. I guess thinking about some of those kind of conditions, about the kind of curatorial and institutional structures that support performance, both in the UK and obviously kind of a conversation that was kind of international and comparing some of those ideas. In particular, actually, I was just saying to these guys this morning that actually something that's really nice for me about this moment is that there's kind of no difference about whether or not you're sort of 500 meters away from me or the other side of the world. My experience of having a conversation with you is exactly the same. And so we thought it was actually a really nice way of opening up this kind of conversation and this dialogue with some colleagues internationally. So just to introduce Grace and Carol very quickly, and then to let you know that the idea will be that they will have a kind of conversation for half an hour or 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open that up to some questions. So the way that you do these questions is by going into the chat at the bottom of your screen, and you can type something to us, and then we'll try and kind of answer them all. So Grace Schwindt is here, and she's an artist who's based in London, but actually she's in Amsterdam. And she and I have worked together a couple of times in the past, and so but she's also represented by Zeno X Gallery in Antwerp, and she's done lots of different kind of shows across the UK and in Europe. So the work that we just showed was part of Performatique in Brussels, and she was part of the Block Universe Festival at the Royal Academy. She had a solo show last year at the CCA in Glasgow, but was also shown at the Showroom in London and at East Side Projects and Sight Gallery in Sheffield. She's got a currently delayed exhibition on at the Imperial War Museum in London, and also as part of a touring show of the Arts Council collection I don't know where the show is actually. It's a touring exhibition as part of the Arts Council collection. And then secondly, we have in conversation with Carol Yinghua Lu, who is a PhD scholar at the University of Melbourne and is in Beijing at the moment, and is the director of the Beijing Inside Out Art Museum. She's also an art critic and contributing editor to Frieze magazine, and most recently was on the jury for the Golden Lion Award at the 2011 Venice Art Biennale. Carol and Grace worked together on an exhibition in Chengdu in China in 17, and a show that Carol co-curated with another curator called Liu Ding, who as part of the first Anren Biennial there, which featured the work that had been shown here at Sight Gallery and the Showroom and Sight Gallery in Sheffield. Only a free individual can create a free society. So one of the things that we thought was really nice about kind of starting to have this conversation with Grace and Carol this morning was really sort of partly thinking about some of those things that came up through that work that we just showed, which is questions about performance in relation to sculpture and film and documentation and architecture, and the way that Grace's work in particular has this kind of multidisciplinarity that means that objects can become props for a performance, can become a sculpture, can become a part of a film, and kind of moving through these ideas of kind of use and materiality and the way things touch each other and all of those kind of things. But also, I guess in particular right now, this relationship between maybe the live body and the stage and the screen and the gallery, and thinking about these ideas of kind of coming together and moving apart and things kind of moving around in that way. So we really liked the idea also of Carol maybe telling us a little bit about some of her experiences working both with Grace in China, but also she very recently curated a show with Yvonne Rayner and Wen Huai in Beijing, called Dance Only Exists When It's Performed. So I thought that was a really nice kind of touch point as well for us, which was obviously a work with a two-person show in China with an American choreographer and a Chinese choreographer who had also worked a lot with Trisha Brown. And so these different kind of histories of performance and these different kinds of histories of choreographic practice and how they're being now shown in galleries. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you guys and just allow you to kind of maybe think through some of those ideas together, and then we will start a bit of a conversation in a moment.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose, for the introduction. Sorry, this is quite new, so it takes a bit of playing around.
Maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about the work that you did together, just by way of introduction to your relationship.
Maybe I can start. So first of all, thank you, Grace and Rose, for involving me in this online conversation. Like I was saying before we started today's conversation, to Rose and Grace, in Beijing, we have just been noted one day ago that we are able to open the museums to the public now, from tomorrow, which means that the kind of strict lockdown imposed on the city of Beijing has been lifted, and life is slowly getting back to a kind of normality. Still, we have to wear mask in closed door situations, indoor context, such as museums, but at least the exhibitions and the museums can be open to the public. So for those of you who are still very much in lockdown or kind of suspended mode, there is some hope there. And then I think what's interesting is actually my way of knowing Grace's work has never been through experiencing any of her performances live or kind of physically experiencing her work. I first of all, when Liu Ding and I were planning the Anren Biennial back in 2017, I believe that it was because Liu Ding has seen Grace's work, mostly sculptures, at the Istanbul Biennale back in 2015. I think that's when Liu Ding first saw Grace's work and shared with me the work of Grace, and we both decided to invite her to participate in the Anren Biennale. But due to all kinds of restrictions, we were only able to show a documentation of the performance. Only a free individual can create a free society. So what we saw was only a video documentation instead of the actual performance. We could not stage, we could not reenacted the performance in Anren. And now we have this conversation. So there's always kind of a form of mediation towards understanding and experiencing your work. And so I think to start the conversation, maybe I could ask Grace to talk a little bit about all these kind of different forms of representation or media play in her practice, and how her obsession or fascination with performance has started from the very beginning, because I do believe that you study photography at school.
Yeah, I did actually. So yeah, I think I always try to think like what the relationships are between these different media and these different materials, and in my practice, because there's often this question. So I think for me, in a way, like all these different materials are really equal and feel very much the same, because I think I see every individual element as a material, actually. So including a sound or a movement of a body. So that's equal, let's say, to a ceramic or a watercolor. So often in works, these different elements actually become layered. So in the film, actually, only for individual, I never performed to a live audience. So it was, even though I wanted to at some stages, but it was what you saw was actually just performance for the camera. So I often also think that my films, in a way, maybe can be more described as performances for the camera rather than a film. And sometimes also these films then later become live performances, or the other way around. But of course, these materials are not equal in terms of what what they involved in the production. So when I work with people, the material of a voice or the material of the actual body has a lot of labor behind it, and a lot of specific needs, in terms of resources, like to find people, space, temperature, time, and so on. Because of course bodies are fragile in a different way to, let's say, ceramic, but there's different needs and different relationships, emotional relationships as well. And so in a way, I'm of course not free to make a decision to think, oh, that's a watercolor, or that's a voice, and what am I going to use? So, but I think in terms of my intentions or my feeling, for me, it's really, thinking of all these different material, let's say, I'm working with, or I'm kind of feeling close to. For me, the important moment is when different materials touch, this kind of very moment when they meet. And because I think for me, what's most interesting, or what I'm most invested in, is to create or find a moment together where something can happen that is absolutely kind of resilient to existing logics of any kind of social political structures. Because for me, most existing structures have violence in them. So it's, in a way, when I think of these different materials, I think it's for me a way to push, to find even a brief moment where and I liked this word logic actually here. And the other day, because I kind of had more time watching videos or interviews and stuff online. So Lawrence Weiner used this word logic, and kind of saying, actually, in the art, one of the good things in art is that you're not expected to create a logic that fits in pre-existing models. And so I think, like, for me, it can happen in these moments. And for example, in Only Free Individual, Creative Free Society, there, well, maybe not the first time, but it was really a moment where movement and the relationship between the costumes, which also consisted of materials like metal or wood, and were then next to skin. So kind of the balance between, like fragility and strength and care and violence I can kind of negotiate in a way with these different media. So that's one aspect of it, which is more from my point of view, of course. And I guess the other part is to think about these different conventions that I cannot ignore, or that I'm part of course, like conventions of looking at the body in sculpture, or conventions of looking at the body on a screen in cinema or on theater stage, or then performs in the gallery space, for example, because it's very much learned ways of relating to a body, and having kind of awareness of my own body as a viewer. So there's of course lots of different ways of lots of conventions, but also lots of histories that change these conventions. So maybe I stop talking because it's difficult to kind of negotiate this on screen, this relationship, how long you talk.
No, that's great. Actually, can you talk a little bit more specifically in terms of your idea about logic, or creating a kind of logic that's independent of existing structures, existing kind of conventions in the work that we just seen at the very beginning of our conversation, Opera and Still?
Opera and Still is a performance. So it's like a 50-minute performance, and Rose showed like part of the beginning of that performance. And it started with a research trip to Shetland Island with Pavilion in Leeds, the arts organization Pavilion. And we basically, they started with this idea of kind of talking to people about how the oil industry affects the communities and affects the environment and different people there. And I kind of really got stuck with this conversation that I had with a birder there. And a birder is a scientist who observes birds, and in his case, for oil contamination. So he walks along the shore, like specific routes, and he retired recently, but he did it for 40 years or something. And so he always walked along the shore, always the same route, which I thought was great in terms of, for me, thinking about repetition of movement and choreographies. Also, I kind of tried to translate it also into thinking through dance choreographies. And so he walked along the shore always and picked up birds or parts of birds that have been washed ashore to see if they have oil stains on them. And actually, I kind of zoomed in more and more and more to this moment where he touches the birds, the dead birds, or the well, sometimes they were not dead, but injured birds. And he said he doesn't want to use gloves because he felt it's disrespectful. He didn't feel right about it. So he actually touched them with his bare hands, and that touch could, and did also contaminate him at times, because the oil, of course, also goes into the body. So I was, really kind of zoomed into this moment of touch, because also when I studied photography, like long time ago now, I was always interested in this notion of the history of touch, because it helped me to think about kind of an alternative to looking at someone or something that's different from me from a safe distance, because that always felt extremely violent. So this history, this notion of history of touch, which, well, there's lots of people, of course, who spoke about it, but for example, Edward Said, or the Turkish-German writer Zafer Şenocak, or also Paul Celan, for example, kind of writing about imagining a meeting, or it has a lot of potential, I think, to interrupt a certain model of relating to each other. And I think, for example, two notions that I find really interesting to think about in that context is this idea of tolerance, which is actually, I think, a really dangerous concept, because it declares someone, it puts someone in a position in the need to be tolerated. So it creates an enormous hierarchy. And then I think it would be interesting to even go further and refuse this idea of the need to understand, because that also puts someone in the position of needing to be understood. And so I kind of try to think of models where these needs are eliminated. And so then for me, it's interesting, this idea maybe that like a touch with a random person or a random material, or substance or whatever it is, could be as valid as a thorough attempt to study something that's different. So in a way, like to touch someone who is not required to, say, represent a whole culture or represent, because I think that's not possible anyway. So I guess in this work, also Opera and Steel, I really focused on this, let's say, random touch between this scientist and the oiled bird. And I use this, and it actually kind of, I keep coming back to that moment, even now in my drawings and so on and so forth. Like, it really helps me to think through, like almost, I can go quite far with this in my thoughts, but almost a revolutionary potential to use wounds or use vulnerability as a possibility to create an encounter that is non-violent. I mean, that's kind of my aim, if it's ever possible, of course. And so now, of course, I have to think about, like, because I focused so much on the actual touch, I always repeat it, it has to be an actual touch, like, and now, of course, the actual touch can potentially bring harm to someone in this COVID-19 moment. So I have no idea what this means to relationships, and what this situation, for example, now means in terms of being in touch or creating an encounter, a moment, of like an online talk, even though I do feel in touch now with you guys. And I only have like a number for the participants, which is like very, very abstract. I know some people who are there listening, but normally you kind of feel people in different ways. So I think it would be not good if it's a substitute. But we have already the news from you, Carol, that museums are opening. So I don't know. But then, of course, also we said, like, who knows what actually is safe, because it's completely not transparent what governments are telling us. So that's a different negotiation then. So anyways, I keep, so Opera and Steel was really focusing on that moment of touch. And I worked with a lot of different media actually there, because I put 2 sculptures in the theater space. So it was first on the theater stage. And I had audience on both sides, because I kind of wanted one part of the audience to become a material for the other part of the audience, and almost like a mirror of the other one, of the other side. So, so there was sculpture, there was music. I worked as a musician. In acrobats, I was thinking a lot about, like, what can happen if I kind of hold or repeat movement. Would then the viewer perceive a live body, as like also sculpturally, and what happens in that moment? So that relationship between thinking of maybe performance as a documentation, seeing sculpture as a documentation of performance, or of like a movement or sound, and then the other way around, like trying to think sculpturally, trying to think about performance sculpturally. So and then later I put these sculptures and also performers in a museum exhibition. So then, of course, like, it was in Seoul, and first people expected the performance to start and have like a duration, and but then it went on, like, ongoing. The performance was ongoing. It was an acrobat kind of doing movements in a space. And after a while, people kind of moved around actually the body and came quite close to the body, which I really liked and encouraged. So that's from Opera and Steel. Then the dancers I included from another work.
Were the performers found in Seoul, or you train a different group of performers?
Yes.
Or it was one group of performers from?
Exactly. The dancer was from Seoul, and the acrobat actually came from China. She traveled over, because it was quite difficult to find someone who could be upside down for 30 seconds. And this acrobat, she's a gymnast, actually, an amazing gymnast, and so she came from China. But basically, I most of the time I work with performers who live in this space, in the place where I go. And not always, but most, like, I try always to find people there. I mean, logistically, but sometimes I also continue working with the same people. Then I try to bring maybe 1 or 2 people also over to places.
Would you consider that you are also choreographing the movements, or you work with the choreographer besides directing the whole performance?
Well, I don't work with choreographers, actually. I work, but I choreograph together with the dancers always, I would say. So I kind of I have a specific dance language, let's say, in my mind, and which which has more to do with intention or kind of intention or relationship between to one's own body, like where the focus is. So it's quite minimal movements often, and often it's quite broken down kind of dance movements. And then I work out, so I have kind of a structure and a choreography in terms of the narrative, let's say, because very often the dance moves from also different actions, let's say, into a dance, and then I work with the dancers to try out different movements, to try out from kind of often having this set and then figuring out a transition to another space, so I work very closely with the dancers.
I'm very interested in the idea of performances being reperformed and being repeated, restaged. When I was working with Yvonne Rena's exhibition, she was not able to travel to Beijing, and we ended up actually inviting a dancer who has been dancing with her for over 30 years. She came and kind of taught the movements to dancers she found in Beijing. So there was a series of kind of notations or scripts, so to speak, that we could use to reenact. But of course, there were a lot of expressions being brought in by this specific dancer who has a very kind of internalized understanding of Yvonne Rena's intention for the performances. So I wonder, in your case, for example, will someone be able to redirect your performances, or it has to be you who?
Yeah, that's a question, and I because in a way for me, it's when I don't think about having to translate it to someone else, these directions, for me they're very I don't know, like logical, or and but of course it's I think it's actually very possible to do this, because I think it's because I thought about it also in the context of performance exchange now, like how to deal with this material of a body in a museum when it's being restaged, the performance, and I think like there's practical directions, like for example I make a lot of drawings for kind of scores, dance scores for the movements. So only for individual it was it was kind of scored to every tiny movement. It was crazy. Like I had drawings: lift your arm 90 degrees, then move it forward 30 degrees. I don't know. It was really, every detail was worked out, and that and then I kind of taught the dancers. So in other moments it's not that as strict, but that's one part. The other part is to kind of put into words ideas about more emotional ideas of relationship to the body, relationship to the space, because these things also determine timing and intensity of in certain moments of that choreography, or so I think it's in a way it's interesting to translate it into language, like thinking of I always have to think also in terms of language when I direct, let's say, a singer. It's kind of different than talking to a dancer, using different kinds of images in a way, but I like also to use similar language and kind of think of a sound as an image that can also like kind of a material that then would be translated as a for a dancer in a different way, but actually using a similar atmosphere, feeling. So I think for me it's actually really interesting to translate all these different aspects into language, like as instructions, because then they become, they become a different kind of, I keep using this material, but this word, it's quite, I don't know how to think about it differently. Then these intentions become a material as well. And I think that's actually quite a nice relationship for a dancer, like a relationship between the dancer and then whoever restages this performance. But also I think other things need to be taken into consideration, like I have specific relationships to the dancers in terms of taking care of them, like what kind of, I mean, these are in a way practical things, but they also become part of the performance, I think, like what kind of space a performer needs to prepare, to rest, to like these kind of aspects. So I think, but I think in terms, it's an interesting thing. I want to think it as of an interesting aspect rather than a scary aspect. To think of that translation process.
I know that, for example, only a free individual can create a free society. Actually, have been reperformed many times. How many times in total?
I mean, the only free individual was only shown, like repeated on as the film version.
I see.
So, but like for example, only Opera in Steel was reperformed with different performers in Amsterdam. And it was different, it was different. For me, it was different, but the difference was okay, because I think the work was intact, but it was like in different space, different performers. But yeah, so I think also that like like the artist has the responsibility to identify what it is that needs to stay intact, and what is it that is maybe okay to change, like even like aspects like the gender of the performers or the age or
I know that the project that you are conceiving for the performance exchange program actually involves kind of a physical presence in the space and the kind of interaction with the audience. Is that a conscious transition you are making? Maybe you can talk about this idea.
I always really I always think, I like thinking about this, like what the proposal is to the viewer and their bodies, which are of course very restricted to these conventions. In theater, for example, you have the auditorium and so on. I mean, you can of course break it, and it has been done lots of times, but for example, Opera in Steel, I wanted the opera singer goes really close to the audience at one point and sings this high note, and then I don't know, I had this kind of idea of the audience actually being able to look inside her body through the open mouth, which related like to actually Apollo and Daphne sculpture by Bernini, of this idea of this open mouth, kind of trying to tell us an emotion or an intention of the figure. But so I kind of pushed that in this performance, for example, asking the performer, and also for an opera singer, it's quite uncomfortable to be really close to an audience because the face is, it's kind of like, I think they want to also protect their expressions and so on. So for the new performance, basically the idea is to create an instrument where the viewer is inside the body of the instrument together with the performer. So that's in a way new, let's say, that I tried, but in the actual experience, I want the viewer to be quite free to move around, and to kind of also sit or stand and go quite close to the performer without touching in this case. But I think like a lot, about this these conventions and what they mean like for the audience body, like to go in, even to take that route of going to the box office, buying a ticket, going in the auditorium, or in a gallery, which is completely different.
I can see that there is a question from Rose. I think she would like you to talk about the idea of translation in terms of audience, to talk about how different audiences experience the live moment and these ideas of touch. You want to respond to that?
So there's a lot of things in there, Rose. Hang on. Yeah. Oh God. This is a difficult thing, of course, because I think like I can provoke touch, let's say, but of course, yeah, often it's not a direct touch, because often the audience cannot touch the artwork actually, because it might fall, or sometimes people can, and actually most of the time people do, in fact. So, and that's also fine. But I think maybe what's interesting for me to think in that terms is that, like, as an artist, you propose almost like a contract or something to the audience. Actually, Ian White, who I dearly miss, because yeah, he worked with Ivan Reiner, by the way, also. Ian White. He worked with, so for example, he worked with me, and I don't know, we never really defined a role for him, but sometimes we called him like a dramaturg for me or something like that. So he, in a way, worked with me choreographing that movement. So then when he died, it was quite difficult to continue that alone. So I had to grow up a bit and kind of figure out how to negotiate that without him. But he used different notions that are still like really important for me to think about. So one is this idea of a contract. So it's like I offer a contract to the audience. So for example, to come into the space, into a video, like an Anren Biennial, like to come into it's an 80-minute film, and it starts at this time, and then you can watch it for 80 minutes. And what's actually for me a nice experience, I mean, not nice, it's painful also, of course, but when an audience member breaks that contract and like moves out, gets up and leaves, for example, but then in a way that breaking of this contract becomes kind of a material thing that I can deal with, I can negotiate, and which I think for this online situation we're in now, that's missing now, because I don't know, like some participants might get bored and they say, or need to go for a bit and come back, which is really nice, but I don't know, like, or Only for Individual was really nice surprise. It was really popular with children. And I think if it would be online, I wouldn't know, because children taught me to like be quiet because they were watching it when I was installing it, for example, at the Bayerische Kunstverein. I was like shushed by a child of 5 years old, because they want to see. So these moments, I think, are kind of, physical moments, let's say, that you experience. And so, yeah, like I don't think it's true. Like sometimes when I think, I just put this in, sometimes, I don't know, I have discussion, then it's this idea of, okay, I just put it in the world and then people can do what they want. Of course, for me, that's not true, because putting something in the world is a really big act, is a political act, and asking someone to physically engage with a work, let's say also having like a touch is not necessarily, of course, just a physical touch. A touch is also the touch between a body and a sound. So at the Istanbul Biennale, had a sound, also working with that text about the oil birds. And yeah, but I think it comes back also, Rose, to this idea of trying to create a moment that doesn't fit into existing logics. And I also, you know, and of course the whole point is to share that moment with an audience. Otherwise it doesn't exist. It only exists inside my body then. And that's kind of, well, it's nice for me maybe, but.
And I suppose I was thinking, I mean, I was thinking a little bit about that question of kind of audience and translation around when you were talking about, for example, showing the work in South Korea or showing the work in China. And, you know, you're talking about this idea of breaking conventions and the different kind of conventions about how people negotiate space and how people understand, you know, what they can and can't do within particular architectures, of course, is not universal. So there are different kind of expectations and different kinds of ways of understanding how we approach, whether that's a performance or whether that's an exhibition space, depending on what kind of cultural history we've got and what kind of relationship to those kind of narratives we've got. So I was thinking, I guess, about this idea of kind of audience and actually Tamsin Hong has kind of followed up with a question in the Q&A around thinking about different kind of, you know, she says, is it difficult to free the audience from the cultural history of viewing a performance from a fixed point? And thinking about kind of this idea of performance and as a kind of theatre, I guess, as opposed to the idea of the performance as something that is more of part of an exhibition or something that she says as you move around and have the freedom to choose their own viewpoint. So I guess I was thinking about kind of touch and translation and audience experiences also in terms of that idea of a kind of cultural history of viewing performance.
Yeah.
Or just what your experience has been of showing those different works in different places, and maybe also with Carol in terms of showing, you know, Yvonne Rainer's work in Beijing and that kind of moment.
Should I answer first? Or
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with Haju Kim, who curated this exhibition in Seoul, where I, you know, where we placed the acrobat and the dancer in the space, and she said that she said she thinks that people will actually be quite far away, will move away from the performer when they start, because it's, you know, it would be unexpected in that museum space, and also because when you first come in, it looks, you know, it looks like an exhibition with sculpture, drawings, film and films. So it's different. Like when I did a performance at the Museum M in Leuven, it was in the context of actually a performance festival that went over a few days, and then it was presented. So there it was quite different, and also there it was actually the proposal was a specific viewing point. So in Seoul, it was for me the most kind of free in terms of the audience's movement. And in first, you know, it's true, like, but I don't know if the same would have happened somewhere else in the context of the audience really just expecting to be in a museum exhibition, which is consisting of sculpture and drawings and film, you know. So I think, I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know how it would be in a different country, but for sure it was like people were, you know, it was like almost scared, or they felt it was like inappropriate that they're there. And then I was, because I had some friends in the audience, so but I had to really force them to go closer. I was like, you have to go closer, please. I don't want people to move away from, because people ended up going to the edges of the walls, really. And also, you know, I wanted people to engage with the different works, you know, from also the other artists. So there, in a way, it was quite challenging because, yeah, but then after a while, like after maybe half an hour, I think people also got used to the body being there, like a live body being there. And people, yeah, it was all right, actually, then. But it was like unexpected. It was unexpected. It was like an interruption. So maybe it was also nice to function as that.
I mean, when I was working with showing Yvonne Rainer in the museum, we actually make a very conscious decision to empty an entire exhibition floor and build a stage in the middle of the space. which means that when the audience come, they see nothing but an empty stage when there is no performances. And that's really quite a strong statement we were making. We put up signs, we also offer a kind of introduction at the reception, just to explain that there are already certain moments when performances take place, and the rest of the time it's an empty stage that's open to the public, so the public could actually go on the stage and do whatever they want. So it became a quite a kind of free space, a free public space inside a museum. And I have found that we actually have very curious audience members, and they're very eager to engage. But of course, we also did a lot of kind of preparation in a way that during the rehearsal periods, we open the rehearsals to the public. So there's a sense of already kind of unfolding the performances, unfolding the inner workings. The audience could come and sit and stand around the stage and see how the performers, how the dancers being coached, how they interacted with their choreographer. So for me, the kind of one of the most interesting experience of working with performance is that the process is so dynamic, the process is so rich that it, unlike a kind of object that you place in the exhibition space, working with performance has the opportunity to kind of unfolding a process of work being made in a way. So every kind of detail of that process, the interactions or the challenges and the kind of behind the scene actions all become part of the work in a way. So we design the exhibition in such a way that the audience can move around, they can come and they become part of this process, this learning process together with the institution. So I think overall, we have curious audience everywhere that are eager to kind of learn and eager to participate.
So there's a question on here from Nora Silva, which I think in some ways is a kind of interesting follow-up to some of those thoughts, where she says, in your working process, do you consider the political, sociological implication of the exhibition space? And do you aim to create a fiction where the performance happens? And I guess I just thought that was quite a nice follow-up in terms of what you've just described, Carol, of this idea of like actually a space where you're also giving that insight into the process, and that, you know, you're sort of simultaneously creating a space for a finished performance, and also for a kind of technical, kind of behind the scenes experience of how difficult it is to make that performance happen. But the question around kind of, I wonder if you could kind of think about the question, both of you, about of kind of political, sociological implications of exhibition spaces as a place for performance.
Carol, do you want to answer this one?
Mm-hmm.
I can also say stuff. I mean,
go ahead. Let me give it some thoughts.
I mean, I think you know, it's kind of a nice way of putting it, Nora. Like, because for me, you know, to create a fiction. I don't know if, like, my initial reaction is that it would be quite it would be kind of a horrible thing to do. I think, like, it would be quite a violent thing to do almost. If that is the intention, let's say, of course, I mean, every space where I worked in is so, like, it's so specific once you place a body in there, like, that is not your own. I mean, because in previous works, but I'm not doing it anymore because I think I went a bit too far. Like, whenever there was like an action that there was some kind of harm being done to a body, like, for example, in Tenon, there was a scene where a body was kind of thrown against the wall. I used my own body because I thought I can only really do this to my own body, you know. then it became a bit too dangerous, and I started to work actually with stunt people, one of my favorite performers. But yeah, so in a way, it's I don't know, I feel it's like a massive responsibility to put actually for me it's like almost overwhelming responsibility to put a body in a space. Also, like not just in terms of practicalities, which actually are not just practicalities, like because they're part of the building. Let's say concrete floor for dance is like really harmful, or so. But I mean, it's not political, sociological, but it could be part of a context in which the building was built. And but these conventions of like I also put a body. I invite someone to dance or a different kind of performer in a space that has very specific rules of the audience looking at their bodies. I mean, it's like a history of conventions of looking at the body that's very fixed, and it's kind of, I think these conventions are quite, I mean, they're really difficult for me to deal with, because they have a lot of values in them that that are social values and values of what a body is supposed to represent. And even just this act of asking a body to represent something, because of course a body becomes a representation in an artwork. So I think you have to negotiate this in a specific space, whether it's a museum or it's a courtyard at the Royal Academy, for example. That I invited the opera singer, for example, to perform in the courtyard of the Royal Academy, and I found it was quite overwhelming actually, because the building is like massive from all, not just visually, and to think about that building in relationship to her voice was really an interesting negotiation. But of course the voice is anything but fragile. An opera singer's voice is really very powerful and strong, of course. But so we played a lot with that actually. So I at one point you kind of went into these arches and created an echo with the voice, and so we kind of played, but it was quite like it wasn't just a background. I don't know, it can, I think a gallery space, or in this situation, for example, the courtyard of the Royal Academy will never just be a background to the singer. Like it has to be an active element to deal with, because I think otherwise you kind of create a damage without even trying to negotiate that.
And just, I mean, I saw that performance, and then also the same opera singer, Lisa Cassidy, came to do something with you in my flat maybe the following summer or however long, where I was running a series of performances basically in my kind of spare bedroom, which is, 2 meters by 2 meters or something. And the sort of irony there was that I remember you kept on going, can you do it any quieter? Can you do it any quieter? And she was kind of got to the point, she's like, no, I don't go quieter than this. And all of a sudden, what had felt like a kind of like, how do you fill this space, and how do you think about echo, and, the experience of seeing the same kinds of sounds coming from the same voice, but in that moment of something that was, trying to create a sort of promenade basically through the 5 meters of my corridor into my spare bedroom, was a completely different set of, and obviously then you're negotiating a very private, what is traditionally a very kind of private space, and the volume of that work really kind of, in both cases for me, was incredibly important in terms of how it filled and what it did to your experience of both of those kind of spaces in very different ways.
Yeah, I mean it was completely different scenario, and the voice became a very different material. And because of course this negotiation, for me always is difficult, but also within that negotiation, for example, in the courtyard, a lot of beautiful, amazing things happen when the voice hits the architecture, or the architecture, because there's also a lot of moments, like there were moments where the voice kind of hit the architecture like let's say in my experience, like in my perception. But then there were also moments where the architecture kind of, you know, embraced the voice or carried the voice, and or yeah, like and I think this distance was like a completely different situation, obviously, but yeah, also in unexpected ways in your flat, because at the Royal Academy, the Lisa was kind of came in at the very end of the courtyard, and before you saw her, in a way, you heard her voice, because somehow the courtyard, the architecture kind of carried her voice across. And so that was a moment where I thought a very kind of gentle part of that, of this architecture came out. And yeah, so then when we afterwards went into your flat, I think it was also then the negotiation was more of thinking of the person, like the body of the opera singer of Lisa, as a body that is like the same as the audience's body, but then somehow there's this moment where she becomes a representation, and that's a really strange moment when that happens in like inside a flat or in like on a dinner table, you know, because normally at a dinner table nobody becomes a representation, whatever that means. So that was for me like a nice moment that was kind of accelerated in that space, because of course in the Royal Academy courtyard, you know, she you know, there the convention is of course to think through that, like think through representational kind of like logics. And so there she functioned, she was quite a abstract, you know, she was quite abstract as a body there, I think.
Quite sculptural in that sense.
Yeah, like she represented more like concepts or something than being actually a, you know, a body.
So there's a question from Alexandra Warder, which I think maybe is also a kind of follow-up from that, where she asks whether there have been any kind of changes to your approach in creating or thinking about performance now, particularly at this moment when kind of, you know, the freedom of travel is being curtailed, and that idea of thinking about kind of how performance is communicated to audiences at a time when when maybe those representations, I mean, as Carol was saying right at the very beginning of this conversation, you know, when these kind of representations are all moving online, or thinking about, you know, what that kind of digital kind of relationship to performance might be. Is that something that you started to think about at all?
Me? I don't know. I kind of hope that we don't have to. I don't know. Yes, I think like it makes me rethink like notions that I really took for granted in a way, like for example touch. And so the situation now, you know, with COVID-19 makes me think like, okay, what, you know, maybe it's still possible to create this encounter with an audience without actually a touch. Often actually, in fact, it's not a real touch in an artwork. So maybe, you know, there's possibilities there, but I don't know. I think the online world is, for me, it's very difficult to think that they are, that that's a substitute somehow, like, because, yeah, I don't know. I mean, now, for example, for this performance for Rose project, Performance Exchange, I start to, you know, work. I start to work like in a way in terms of having conversations with, you know, the dad, like there would be a dancer and musician. So we start to talk, and actually these conversations are great because we're more available than usual. So we can like talk on the, you know, over Skype, and then I start to work with an instrument maker, and you can go quite far. Okay, but this is not really answering the question. I think, yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel we're still so in the middle of it, like especially in the UK or here in Europe, like that it's, I don't know, for me it's impossible to think, or maybe I don't want to or refuse to think if what happens if it's not possible to meet, you know, again. I mean, that would be really quite a, I don't know, probably quite a bad situation, a terrible world actually. So I'm rethinking concepts, let's say. It's a, you know, it's kind of a time of reflection, I guess, and a time of things that we took for granted, of possibilities to meet and so on. But, and of spaces maybe. But yeah, I think that's as far as I kind of went in a way.
So there's a couple of final questions which I think we've got time for. So one that from Viviana, which asks, this is kind of taking the conversation slightly somewhere else, but that asks about the idea of, she says that she's interested in the animal-human relationship, even as a result of COVID-19 being zoonotic. Are we focused here we've been talking a lot about kind of human touch, but what about animal touch?
Oh well, I love working with animals actually, and I recently made a film with a horse that was shown actually at CCA. So like and and then I did another work with a horse actually. So actual animals, and yeah, it's it is a very different touch actually, and it was great because it puts things a bit in perspective. Like making a film can be very stressful, and having a horse there, you cannot be stressful, so you have to be calm, and you have to, and in specific, actually I wanted to work with horses because the film was about kind of figuring out different ways of communication, and like horses have a very specific way of communicating, and which is kind of mirroring your emotions, and actually they used also for kind of as therapy for people who have speech problems, and successfully, or they kind of mirror you. So when you get scared, I mean, in very simple ways, like when you feel scared or aggressive, the horse reacts immediately. So this relationship was kind of immediate, and you had to deal with your own behavior and your own way that it reflected the way how you actually deal with people around you. So the horse was kind of showing us what we're doing, and and then of course the relationship in the film was like there were all kinds of different relationships between this dancer and then two musicians, and there were like a lot of these relationships were with the horse. So the film starts actually by the singer singing to the horse, like being really close up, singing to the horse, and the horse responded a lot, like, you know, kind of listened to it and pushed her away at times, and like there was a lot of interaction actually with the horse. And then later there were different scenes as well. So and of course also the figure of the bird is really important. The touch with the bird, between the bird and the bird, that touch it was, I kind of moved on, used a lot, and in my drawings I use a lot of animals actually, and the kind of relationship with humans. And I guess it's a different kind of balance to this relationship between care and violence, I guess. I don't know. There's a lot to think about still for me, to be honest. So what that means.
And
Carol, you
Sorry.
took part in that talk at CCA as well, didn't you? About animal, what was it called? Carol, you went to CCA Glasgow. You took part in this.
Yes, yes. Vivian is from CCA. That's why she's asking the question.
There's a lot of animals going on at CCA actually with us.
I was actually going to ask you one thing that I'm very curious about, because I think that you actually talk a lot. You're reflecting and critiquing a lot about the kind of existing conventions, structures, and also the idea about capitalism, for example. I want to ask you about the script, the narratives in your performances, because I've noticed that it's actually a very central element of many of your performances. Can you talk a little bit about these narratives? I know that in the only a free individual can create a free society. The narrative came from a taxi driver's conversation with you. How about in opera and still, for example, also there was a lot of rhetorics, narrative in the performance. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think maybe it comes back to this idea of starting a work with a, let's say, random with a kind of encounter with a random person, let's say, with one person, and in any case, it's not so random, but and that kind of being the starting point of a work. I think, yeah, I've done it, like I often do that, like use a conversation with a person as kind of, it becomes in a way one of the materials, like an only free individual, even though there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of text. It's important also that then the other elements like dance, the costumes, the different objects, the different actions were not kind of supporting that narrative, supporting to tell the narrative, but they became kind of equal, and one came in and out. And in Five Services All White that we showed at CCA, it was also there the text became much more minimal actually, and it was based on a conversation with my grandfather on his deathbed in a kind of health institution, in a clinic, and so there the text that was the first time I really used a text, but really pulled it back as a text, and then really used also music and dance quite predominantly next to the text. But I think it's one way of communication that I use in my work. But I think it's important for me to say that it's only one way next to other ways, like next to singing, next to musical scores. And sometimes, I don't know, like I think maybe more now that it's a more problematic way. For me, it's almost a safer way, which I always have the feeling that if it feels safe, it's not good for me to do, because maybe it's a way to back myself up or to hide behind or something. Because but I don't know, maybe that's more my own negotiation. But I think text can be, seems to be a straightforward way of communication, but I think it's not actually. It's more complicated. And also, what Viviana said, think about in relation to communication through an animal, like what you're proposing there is, I don't know, like the scene where the singer was singing to the horse, and it was really, really close up, and the horse is, is a big horse. And I don't know, like it's a different dynamic there, but I think is as precise as, a performer kind of speaking a monologue about, I don't know, going down the shore and touching the birds. Like, yeah. It's definitely something I'm you know, still kind of figuring out in every work, like that relationship between the spoken, like the actual, like the text and movements, sounds, music. Yeah.
But could you tell us a bit about the work that you've just done with the Imperial War Museum then? Because also, I mean, I guess one of the things that strikes me in terms of what you're just saying there is about an idea about representing other people's stories as well. And we were having quite a long conversation before about that process of, you know, the idea of kind of interviewing people, for example, and then taking that and, you know, well, very manifestly not trying to represent those stories.
Yeah, I think it's, so I started using my own family a lot in the beginning, and I kind of probably for wrong reasons felt have some more freedom, you know. Yeah, but I think I felt it's quite a responsibility. I mean, it's a strange relationship to do that. It creates a strange relationship, but I think like for the Imperial War Museum, for example, I worked with different, like I made sculptures and music pieces, and each resulted from a conversation with someone who lost their home due to war. So, and it, like, you know, it kind of changed through the process, because it became really clear. I mean, it was clear from the beginning, but it became so completely clear that I'm only able to create a work that represents this specific encounter between, you know, when I met that person. And it was conditioned through all sorts of things, you know. I mean, most of the people I met several times, so it was kind of a period. But we met in often quite specific locations. Like, for example, with one woman I met in a place here in Amsterdam, where she first came from Sarajevo, when she first fled from Sarajevo and came to Amsterdam. And it was kind of a place where journalists met and helped people to come and so on. So it was kind of significance. So all these different kind of moments, you know, I don't know, different other things too, like it was very noisy that day or whatever. But I think like the sculptures kind of had the ambition to represent that moment, kind of that what happened between that person and me in that moment. Of course, it's, yeah, so it's a really difficult translation process, because because I of course then I go away and they all were completely generous and trusting, and, you know, like really quite a lot happened in these conversations. And then I make a sculpture that I put into the Imperial War Museum, so it becomes like a thing that represents some of this story, at least. So it's, yeah, and then and then of course also there's a different, another process added on top of it, which is the negotiation between me and the ceramic, the clay, and kind of sculpting it and building it. And it was based, like, starting point was the buildings that they lost, like the homes that they lost. So often it didn't feel right, for example, to create a building that's completely safe and closed, because because these buildings weren't anymore. And it didn't feel like right to do that. But I also, it's a lot, like, it was challenging in terms of things, because I'm already always thinking about this relationship between, you know, care and kind of creating potentially something violent when you make a representation. And also, on the other hand, of course, the opposite of proposing maybe a possibility of, I don't know, it sounds very big, but of some kind of healing process, or inviting at least to share vulnerability, which can maybe lead to like a positive moment, you know. So it was quite intense, that, yeah, for that project, for sure.
So I'm kind of aware of the time, and we've been going actually nearly like an hour and a half now. So I don't know if there are one or two questions that we haven't kind of covered. Actually, I think Claire Tomley wrote a question a while ago around kind of trust from different sites and the idea of kind of making performance with material-based practice, which I guess in some ways we've kind of touched on. And then there's a question about the kind of value of performance-based practice. So I don't know whether or not Grace and Carol, you've got anything kind of final words to say that maybe thinks about that idea of kind of value, I guess, across a different kind of spectrum of what that word means for performance practice, maybe in relation to kind of the difference between showing films or making exhibitions.
I mean, I can speak specifically about the experience of working on the exhibition that you mentioned earlier on Yvonne Rena and Wen Hui. Both choreographers, they have had a huge body of works, and for us to show Yvonne Rena in Beijing, for example, it was really a huge challenge because there is very little kind of understanding of her work. And so first of all, we needed to kind of do a lot of educational preparation, and also to introduce her kind of very complex body of work. We were also trying to show her films in relation to her performances. So that kind of, it was, to make the exhibition, to make the performances, it was a huge learning process for my institution as well as for the audiences in China. So in terms of value, I see in kind of working with performances and with kind of performances that have happened in the past. Basically in Beijing, we already reenacted 2 very early performances from the 60s of Yvonne Rena, and the rest we showed the documentations, videos, scores, her notes, all these materials. But it was still the kind of her process of thinking and the process of working really came through very vividly through all these materials that we show. And also we work with Simon Liang. He's an artist who had worked very closely with Yvonne Rena. So he actually gave many talks in Beijing to kind of help the audience interpret and understand the performances. So I think it's actually quite a challenge to present performances, but at the same time, it's a huge opportunity for the audience or as well as people who work in the art field to learn more about processes of making art, process of working, rather than, as I said earlier, just to see one kind of finished object. And I think it's a very kind of important thing to do for current institutions where there's so much obsession with object-based practices.
Well, for me as an artist who works with performance and with sculpture and drawing and film, and they're all really closely connected, it's of course a really positive thing to have, to see that people more, like institutions and people more and more kind of encourage that and have that conversation, what that means as a material, and like what it means to kind of execute it, and or in your case, as you said, like to introduce it differently to how, like with the sculpture where you can maybe have a text or something, and with Yvonne Rena, you felt you need also talks or have other preparation. So to kind of find different models, also like different ways to show text, and because I think like the let's say this convention of a wall panel and labels that you can, maybe performance also is a way to think about these ways of kind of displaying information, and can be, I don't know. But for me, it's anyways a really positive thing, of course, because performance is really really equal part of everything else that I do.
I mean, I think certainly for when I was setting up Performance Exchange, exactly that. A lot of what we were thinking about was almost the kind of like merging of those two ideas, which is the performance is so kind of integral to so many artists' practices, either as a kind of standalone thing or as part of a kind of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary kind of practice, and actually to think about ways that the different kinds of institutional structures, whether they're museums or whether that's the art market, might kind of hold performance in a more kind of equal way to object-based practice, became really important as a way of understanding that kind of holistic nature of contemporary art practice. And so how do you show it alongside? How do you show it on its own? How do you understand it? And that idea, as Carol's been talking about in particular, of kind of process and liveness as a kind of integrated part of practice, felt like it was really important to me. And particularly, if you're talking about the kind of economic value of it, then there's both the question of how it gets kind of collected, but there's also the question of how it gets supported and how it gets presented, and the kind of economics of museums and the economics of institutions, and the kind of value that we understand, i.e. the amount that it costs to put on a performance, and how we think about understanding that as part of a kind of curatorial kind of or a kind of curatorial kind of interest in terms of the way that museum budgets and all of those kind of things works. Felt like it was really like important just to kind of make that explicit and to understand that. And that value was not necessarily something that was a kind of like economic value was not necessarily something that was a kind of like a negative thing to talk about in relationship to performance, which it's always felt quite difficult to as soon as you start talking about something in the market, it feels like a lot of people are quite kind of hostile to that. And we wanted to find ways to talk about the economics of performance in ways that were more just explicit and understanding of how that would allow you to support it more frequently, potentially.
Yeah, I think that just maybe one comment to that, because part of Performance Exchange was also putting together a document, and where we kind of went through different questions that have been accumulated, and one of for example, also Tate Modern had this made this effort of kind of accumulating questions and
the live list.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was really interesting for me to work through these questions, because you consider so many different aspects, like, from very practical things and organizational things, and what is needed, and what kind of resources, what kind of expertise are needed. Like, for example, in Yvonne Rainer's case, it was probably important to have that person there who could teach the dancers in Beijing, or, what are these different conditions? But then also, what are the conditions to care, the well-being of a live body, so to say, like the performer. And so it was great actually to work through these questions and kind of create a model, and that maybe they can rethink kind of existing models, even to make me think of then, if I replace the performer with a sculpture, like, maybe there are different, like it could, maybe it could be also nice, I don't know, to use different ways to introduce the sculpture even, or I don't know. It just was like really interesting to work through these questions and think what are the requirements and the needs. But in a way, like, it was also all quite logical. I mean, it wasn't so complicated. I think it's like finding a model that, and then it's not so overwhelming anymore. Right.
So I feel like we could go on, but we should probably leave it there because we've been talking for nearly an hour and a half now. So just suffice to say, thank you very much to Grace and to Carol for a really interesting conversation this morning. For everybody, all of the attendees, as Grace said, at a certain point, it becomes really strange because you can only kind of see the three people that you're talking to. And you're aware that there's this kind of list of people listening in, but actually I think there's something really nice about that because it also allows us to maybe kind of have a sort of feeling of intimacy in the conversation that allows you to kind of think a bit more on your feet. Just to say one final thing, this is a series of conversations that we're doing also in partnership with David Roberts Art Foundation. We kind of wanted to come together with them at the moment because we're both organizations that have had huge amounts of kind of have been dedicated, let's say, to thinking about live practice. And obviously right now, whilst everything's closed, live practice is really, you know, kind of one of those things that's very much on hold, let's say. So we've been doing a series of conversations with them, and they're all, the archive of that is now up on YouTube. So you can go and have a look at the previous ones that we've done, but also do please keep an eye out on both our and the David Roberts social media channels. And we've got lots more coming up. And a lot of them are all kind of in the format of in conversation with artists and curators, and really thinking about the people that we're working with and keeping those conversations kind of live and trying to understand what everybody's kind of going through at the moment, but also to be thinking about the future of our programs together. So thank you again to Grace and for Carol and for everybody being here, and we'll hope to see you again at some point soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing it, and Carol, thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure.
So nice to talk to you
And
again.
I hope that the performance can be realized very soon.
Yeah, thank you.
We look forward to good news.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we're very happy to hear that you're reopened. That's all I'll say, because that gives us hope.
Okay.
Fabulous. Thank you, everybody.